There's something fascinating happening in the Black Sea right now that could change the future of warfare in the 21st century forever. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began more than 2 years ago, the war on the land has extended into a war at sea as well, and the Russian Navy has not been having a very good time. The Ukrainians have managed to sink ship after ship after ship in the Black Sea to the point where 2 years into this war, the entire Russian Black Sea fleet that operates in the region has collectively lost around a third of all its vessels and 40% of all its tonnage to the bottom of the sea. And faced with such catastrophic losses largely inflicted in the seas around Crimea, the Ukrainians have forced the majority of the remaining Russian ships in the Black Sea to retreat from their centuries-old headquarters at Sevastopol in Crimea towards a new operating headquarters on the Black Sea's eastern rim at Novorossiysk, hundreds of kilometers away from the military front lines around Crimea. The Ukrainians have shattered the Russian naval blockade on their coastline so thoroughly by this point that the country is now, as of 2024, exporting even more goods to the global market than it was before the invasion even began. And what's most impressive about all of this is that Ukraine has managed to effectively checkmate the Russian Navy in the Black Sea without even having a navy of their own, and without even a single active warship. Ukraine has pulled off what appears to be nothing less than a naval miracle, and how they've managed to do it will be studied at naval war colleges for generations to come. And there are some analysts who have even begun to suggest that Ukraine's unprecedented destruction of the Russian Black Sea fleet has shown that big, expensive surface warships like cruisers, destroyers, and even aircraft carriers could be obsolete weapons of war in the high-tech world of the 21st century. This is how Ukraine, a nation without a navy, managed to effectively destroy an enemy navy that was, on paper, vastly more powerful and capable, and how this might change the world forever. First of all, it's important for you to understand Russia's inherent geographic disadvantages when it comes to its ability to wage naval warfare. Throughout Russian history, Russian naval planners have had to contend with the fact that their coastlines on the Arctic, the Pacific, the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea are all separated from each other by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. It is very geographically difficult to transport warships between the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, the Arctic Ocean, or the Pacific Ocean. And in some cases, it takes literally months worth of travel to accomplish, and the ships have to pass through multiple potentially dangerous narrow choke points all along the way. Because of this, Russia has never been able to effectively concentrate its naval forces in a single theater the same way that the British, the Japanese, or the Americans have been able to do. And so, Russian naval strategy has always had to contend with this so-called four seas problem for centuries. Rather than having a single large operating navy, Russia has been geographically forced to divide its naval forces and operate four separate, smaller, largely independent regional navies in the Arctic, the Pacific, the Baltic, and the Black Sea instead, which has always made the Russian Navy more vulnerable to getting overwhelmed by foreign powers who can more easily concentrate their naval forces into a single location. The most classic example of this was during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The Japanese began the war by concentrating all of their naval forces in the Pacific and launching a surprise attack against the numerically inferior Russian Pacific Fleet that, at the time, was headquartered in Port Arthur in modern-day China. Then, the Russians responded to the attack by assembling additional warships that were all the way over on the other side of Eurasia, in the Baltic and Black Seas. And over a period of 18 months, painstakingly transported them all the way around the world on a journey of 18,000 kilometers to rendezvous in the South China Sea and attack the Japanese Navy in the Pacific. And once they finally got there, the new Russian fleet in the Pacific was exhausted, and it was promptly engaged by the combined Japanese fleet. The new Russian fleet in the Pacific was then almost completely destroyed down to the very last ship in the process, in one of the most catastrophic naval defeats ever suffered in human history, that also offered a prelude to what is currently going on in the Black Sea between Russia and Ukraine today. The modern Russian Black Sea Fleet was founded in 1783, almost immediately after the Crimean Peninsula was first conquered by the Russian Empire from the Ottomans. For more than 240 years since then, the Russian and Soviet Black Sea fleets have always been headquartered in the port of Sevastopol, because it is the most strategically significant natural harbor that can be found anywhere in the entire Black Sea. It's a warm water port year-round that doesn't freeze over during the winter, meaning that it can be accessed by ships without needing icebreakers year-round. And it's also a deep water port, which means means that its waters are deep enough to house larger displacement warships and submarines. It's a large and well-protected natural harbor that cuts into the Crimean landmass that can accommodate a very large number of ships and submarines. And it sits in a highly strategic commanding location at Crimea's southern tip, almost precisely in the geographic center of the Black Sea, enabling warships and submarines based inside to rapidly sortie out and access any threats across the region. Because of these natural advantages, whoever has been able to control Sevastopol has been able to effectively dominate the entire Black Sea region for centuries. And these natural advantages have been compounded by the fact that over the centuries that the Black Sea Fleet has been based there, Sevastopol has more critical naval infrastructure and repair and support facilities than anywhere else in the Black Sea too, which cements its location as the most ideal place in the region to keep a navy at. But the Black Sea Fleet's very existence and centuries-long presence in Sevastopol first came into open question a little more than 30 years ago in 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed and dissolved. Crimea and Sevastopol each found themselves as a part of the newly independent Ukraine. And by extension, so did virtually the entire Soviet Black Sea Fleet that found itself headquartered there. There were significant arguments and disagreements on the fate of the hundreds of ships in the Black Sea after the Soviet Union dissolved, with both Russia and Ukraine claiming to be the fleet's legal inheritors. In 1995, Russian President Boris Yeltsin and Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma agreed on a temporary interim solution that placed the entire Black Sea Fleet under a joint Russian-Ukrainian command, still based out of Sevastopol until a more long-term solution could be agreed upon. That more long-term solution came 2 years later in 1997, with the Black Sea Fleet Partition Treaty, which divided the old Soviet Black Sea Fleet's assets 82% to Russia and 18% to Ukraine, while Russia retained the right to lease naval facilities in the port of Sevastopol from Ukraine for an annual fee of $97 million for a period of 20 years until 2017. From then on, the separate Russian Black Sea Fleet and the Ukrainian Navy remained jointly headquartered in Sevastopol, as they had been for centuries. But the drama between them continued on. In 2009, the then pro-Western and pro-EU president of Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, announced that he would not extend the Russian Black Sea Fleet's lease to Sevastopol after it expired in 2017, stating that the Russian Black Sea Fleet would have to move elsewhere outside of Ukraine by that point, likely to Russia's other port further to the east at Novorossiysk. But while Novorossiysk is a large natural harbor, it's not as large or as well protected as the harbor at Sevastopol is. It also has a major civilian merchant marine port that competes in the harbor for the smaller amount of available space that's absent in Sevastopol. It lacks the commanding position in the center of the Black Sea that Sevastopol occupies, and it lacks the same kind of expensive naval infrastructure and facilities that have been built up in Sevastopol over decades, which all makes Novorossiysk just a much less attractive port to headquarter a fleet at than Sevastopol. So the Russians didn't really want to leave Sevastopol, and so then after the more pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych became Ukraine's next president in 2010, the Russians wasted no time at all in negotiating with them to secure their access to Sevastopol for the foreseeable future. Less than 2 months after assuming the Ukrainian presidency in April of 2010, Yanukovych renegotiated the terms of Russia's lease to their naval facilities at Sevastopol. Dubbed the Kharkiv Pact, the new terms extended the Russian Navy's lease at Sevastopol for decades until 2042, with an additional option baked in to extend the lease for another 5 years longer until 2047, with considerations for even further renewals after that. At the time, the Russian Black Sea Fleet's continued presence in Sevastopol seemed to be legally secured for all of the foreseeable future. But in less than 4 years after the Kharkiv Pact was signed in 2010, it would all be thrown into chaos. In November of 2013, protests began in Ukraine against Yanukovych's pro-Russian foreign policy that eventually culminated into a full-blown revolution by February of 2014 that ousted Yanukovych from power and sent him into exile in Russia. Then, worried that the new incoming Ukrainian government that took over afterwards would revoke the terms of the Kharkiv Pact and return to the previous Yushchenko-era policy of expelling the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol, the Russians quickly decided to invade Crimea with special forces and occupied it, before unilaterally declaring to annex it the following month. Russia's rapid takeover of Crimea and Sevastopol back then suddenly put the majority of the Ukrainian Navy that was inherited from the Soviet Black Sea Fleet and that was also headquartered in Sevastopol under Russian control. About 5,000 of the Ukrainian Navy sailors either defected and joined with Russia, fled, or were captured, and the vast majority of Ukraine's naval assets were captured and seized intact, which combined cut the Ukrainian Navy's size down by about 2/3 virtually overnight. The only warships that Ukraine had left over after the Russian seizure of Sevastopol were 4 small corvettes and 1 frigate that became their flagship, the Hetman Sahaydachny, along with a few smaller patrol boats, and they were all forced to relocate their operating headquarters away from Sevastopol further west to Odessa. And then in the years that followed after Russia's takeover of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine continued suffering even further naval setbacks too, especially in the Sea of Azov region. 2 years after the Crimea takeover in February of 2016, the Russians began building out the Crimean Bridge to link the Russian mainland with Crimea across the narrow Kerch Strait, the only maritime passing between the Sea of Azov and the Greater Black Sea. When the bridge was finished 2 years later in 2018, it became the longest bridge in Europe, and Russia was able to use the bridge and some of their own warships to effectively enforce a light blockade of the Ukrainian Azov ports like Berdyansk and Mariupol. Shortly after the bridge's completion in 2018, the Russians temporarily blocked all Ukrainian merchant vessels from traveling through the Kerch Strait, and they even seized 3 of Ukraine's small number of remaining naval vessels. And even though the Russians didn't end up enforcing the blockade for long and even returned the ships they seized back to Ukraine, the incident still highlighted how weak and vulnerable the Ukrainian Navy had truly become by that point. Then, in the build-up toward Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that began in February of 2022, the Russians relocated 6 of their warships from elsewhere in January, the month before they invaded, to reinforce the Black Sea Fleet further, because they knew that after they started the invasion, they probably wouldn't be able to send any additional warships into the Black Sea to replace any losses they might end up suffering. And this is because of the intricacies of a nearly century-old international treaty known as the Montreux Convention. Signed all the way back in 1936, Montreux has remained in force ever since, and it regulates all maritime passage through the strategically important Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus in the northeast and the Dardanelles to the southwest, which together form the only navigable passageway between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea, and from there the Mediterranean and the Greater World Ocean. The straits are the only possible way that vessels from Georgia, Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria can access the global ocean, and the only way that Russia's regional vessels in the Black Sea can access the global ocean too. Under the terms of Montreux, civilian merchant vessels of any flag are granted unrestricted access through the Turkish Straits whenever they want, as if they're international waters. But warships have much heavier restrictions placed on them. During peacetime, nations that don't have a coast on the Black Sea have restricted access on sending warships through the straits, limited both by tonnage and by the amount of time that they can actually stay in the Black Sea, which has always restricted navies from the US, UK, or France from being able to access the sea. The nations around the Black Sea, including Russia, enjoy fairly free and open access for their warships to use the straits during peacetime, and only the Black Sea nations themselves are ever allowed to send submarines through the straits, while aircraft carriers are always banned regardless of what nation they belong to. And most importantly, the terms of Montreux grant Turkey, who controls the straits, the legal right to heavily restrict the passage of warships through the straits during a time of war. When any of the Black Sea nations are at war, Turkey reserves the right to close the straits off to any of the warships of the nations at war. And so, within days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 beginning, Turkey exercised this right to block off any additional Russian warships from the Baltic, Arctic, or Pacific fleets from being able to get into the Black Sea and replace any of their losses. Which has meant that ever since the war began, Russia has not been able to replace any of their lost ships in the Black Sea from anywhere else. So whatever they started with there is whatever they'll have to fight and finish the entire war with. Regardless, there were very few people who initially thought that Russia would suffer any devastating losses in the Black Sea when the invasion began. And the general consensus among analysts at the time was that the vastly larger and more powerful Russian Black Sea fleet, recently reinforced by a few more ships from elsewhere, would easily overwhelm the much smaller Ukrainian navy and put the whole country under a withering blockade. The Russian Black Sea Fleet began the war with the battle cruiser Moskva, the flagship, 5 frigates, 13 heavy-duty tank landing ships, 6 modern attack submarines, and dozens of smaller vessels and patrol boats. In total, the fleet had at its disposal around 74 surface warships and 6 submarines, compared to the paltry Ukrainian fleet of 1 frigate and 4 smaller corvettes. Within just the first 2 weeks of the invasion beginning, the naval war already wasn't looking very good from Kiev's perspective. Nearly all of Ukraine's smaller naval vessels were damaged or outright sunk by Russian missiles, while the Ukrainian Navy's flagship, the frigate Hetman Sahaydachny, was deliberately scuttled and destroyed by the Ukrainians themselves while it was in port in Mykolaiv, to prevent it from getting potentially captured by the Russians and used against them. As, at the time, the Russian army had advanced far enough to be on the city's outskirts and they were threatening to capture it. Moreover, the fear of the Russian Navy orchestrating an amphibious landing near Ukraine's most major port remaining, Odessa, was so great in the early weeks of the invasion that the Ukrainians were forced to reinforce the area around the coast with an additional 5,000 troops and 100 tanks that were pulled from the battles that were raging around Ukraine's capital and two largest cities, Kiev and Kharkiv. The Russian Navy captured Ukraine's Snake Island early on into the invasion that strategically sits nearby to major Ukrainian trade routes from Odessa toward the Turkish Straits and the global ocean, while the Russian army captured all of the remaining Ukrainian coastline on the Sea of Azov, including the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol. That enabled the Russian Black Sea Fleet to begin enforcing a near-total maritime blockade of Ukraine's remaining coastline and ports in the west, choking off Ukraine's ability to export or import just about anything by sea. And notably, the Russian blockade choked off Ukraine's ability to export any of their grains or agricultural products by sea, which usually represents more than 40% of Ukraine's export income and around 14% of all Ukrainian jobs. Russia was able to use its bigger navy in the Black Sea to economically strangle Ukraine with a blockade, threaten its remaining shores with amphibious assaults, and bombard Ukrainian cities and military targets from far away with missiles and rockets. And optimism was initially not very high that the Ukrainians would even be able to resist the Russian Navy, let alone defeat or destroy it. But from there, knowing that they faced a vastly superior enemy on paper, Ukraine began adopting several ingenuitive geographic and technological strategies to overcome the stacked odds against them. And Russia's early naval successes in the Black Sea didn't last for very long. Because, from Ukraine's perspective, as the old saying goes, necessity is the mother of all inventions. The first breakthrough was Ukraine's unconventional use of short and long-range land attack ballistic missiles. These kinds of missiles were designed to attack static targets on the ground somewhere, and were decidedly not designed to attack highly mobile ships out at sea. But then the Ukrainians started using them to attack stationary Russian warships that were docked in harbors. The first time they did this was a month into the invasion on the 24th of March 2022, when the Ukrainians were able to use a Soviet-era short-range ballistic missile to hit a Russian heavy-duty tank landing ship known as the Saratov, as it was docked within the Russian-occupied port of Berdyansk on the Sea of Azov, which reportedly caused a huge explosion and caused the Saratov to sink, representing the first major Russian warship lost during the war. And then, less than a month later, came Ukraine's biggest naval victory of the entire war so far. On the 13th of April 2022, the Russian Black Sea Fleet's flagship, the battlecruiser Moskva, was steaming by just east of the occupied Snake Island. The Ukrainians figured out the Moskva's position, and taking a gamble, they decided to fire a pair of Neptune anti-ship missiles at it. The Neptune is a missile designed and built within Ukraine that only entered service in the Ukrainian armed forces the year before the invasion in 2021. And so, it was completely untested in a real-world wartime scenario. They were designed to have an operating range of between 200 and 300 kilometers or 120 to 190 miles, and were designed to take on ships up to 9,000 tons in weight. Fully loaded, the Moskva clocked in at nearly 11,500 tons. But regardless, the Ukrainians decided to fire the Neptunes at it anyway and were likely not expecting significant results. But significant results are exactly what happened. The Neptune missiles both impacted the Moskva and caused catastrophic damage to it, enough that the Russians attempted to tow it back to safety at a port somewhere, only for it to sink beneath the waves down to the bottom of the Black Sea in the process. The loss of the Moskva in April of 2022 represented the first Russian flagship to be lost in action since the devastating defeat of the Russo-Japanese War more than a century previously, and it further represented the single largest warship to be lost in action anywhere since the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano was sunk by the British in 1982 during the Falklands War. The loss of the Moskva also proved the dangerous lethality of Ukraine's Neptune anti-ship missiles that could be fired from land on the country's remaining non-occupied coastline, which effectively enabled the Ukrainians to set up a big area of anti-access area denial across the western Black Sea extending between 200 to 300 kilometers away from the remaining coastline. This area became a huge naval kill zone for any remaining Russian warships that tried to enter it, like the Moskva. And after repeated Ukrainian anti-ship missile strikes on Russia's supply ships that were resupplying the occupied Snake Island, Russia was forced to abandon the island just a couple months later in June of 2022. After that, the remaining Russian Black Sea fleet was effectively forced out of the western Black Sea and confined to the central and eastern portions of the sea, far away and out of range of Ukraine's anti-ship missiles. Lest they ended up meaning the same end as the Moskva. And then, advanced Western-supplied weapons began adding to Ukraine's ingenuity in the naval war even further. By May of 2023, the UK announced that they would be supplying Ukraine with their Storm Shadow cruise missiles, an air-launched cruise missile that has a range of around 250 kilometers or 155 miles. When the Ukrainians first acquired these missiles, they were largely used to target and blow up critical bridges across the military front line on land that were occupied by the Russians. But then the Ukrainians started getting more creative with them when they also began using them to target stationary Russian warships that were docked in ports. In early September of 2023, the Ukrainians fired a series of these Storm Shadow cruise missiles at a dry dock repair facility in the port of Sevastopol in Crimea, which hit and catastrophically damaged another heavy-duty tank landing ship called the Minsk, and even one of the Black Sea Fleet's attack submarines called the Rostov-on-Don, potentially destroying both of them. And then, only a few days after that, the Ukrainians fired a swarm of Storm Shadow missiles at the physical headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol itself as well, which caused catastrophic damage to it. Even more Storm Shadow missiles were used later near the end of December 2023 to attack and apparently sink another Russian heavy-duty tank landing ship called the Novocherkassk, as it was sitting stationary and undergoing repairs in the eastern Crimean city of Feodosia. With their range of 250 kilometers, the Storm Shadow missiles opened up the ability for the Ukrainians to strike any stationary Russian warships sitting in ports in Crimea from the air. And together with the Neptune anti-ship missiles that could hit and sink any moving Russian warships in the western Black Sea, the majority of the Russian Black Sea Fleet was subsequently forced into retreat away from Crimea and relocated to the Russian port of Novorossiysk on the Black Sea's eastern rim instead, largely abandoning their centuries-old headquarters at Sevastopol in the process. But the Russian warships continue to pose a threat to Ukrainian military and civilian targets even in Novorossiysk though, because they fire sea-launched cruise missiles like the Russian-designed Caliber that have a 1,500-kilometer or 930-mile range, which is plenty even from Novorossiysk to continue pounding any target they want to in Ukraine. But even there in Novorossiysk, the Russian warships also weren't going to be safe for long, because the Ukrainians were developing another weapon to attack them from the sea therewith. In November of 2022, 9 months into the invasion, the Ukrainians announced that they were developing a brand new unmanned maritime kamikaze drone. And then, several months later, in July of 2023, this development was finally revealed to the public as the Ukrainian-designed Magara V5 sea drone. The Magara V5 is essentially a small unmanned remote-controlled boat, only 5.5 meters or 18 feet long. It is controlled remotely by an operator using a live-feed camera on the drone that is equipped with night vision. It has enough life to travel for up to 60 hours or up to 800 kilometers, and can carry an explosive payload on board of up to 200 kilograms or 440 pounds. Especially when traveling at night, the drones glide along the surface of the water and are difficult to spot, maintaining a slight stealth capability before they ram into their intended target and explode like a guided torpedo. And with their range of up to 800 kilometers, they can travel across most of the Black Sea from Ukraine's controlled shoreline and attack Russian warships at much greater distances than the Storm Shadow or Neptune missiles can, while offering up another dimension of attack that Russian warships have to be concerned about. And within only days of being revealed, the Magara V5C drone would already see its first action. On the 17th of July 2023, the Ukrainians used 2 of these kamikaze sea drones to attack and blow up a section of the Crimean Bridge, running across the Kerch Strait between Crimea and the Russian mainland. The damaged a section of the road bridge and caused a partial closure of it for the next 3 months. Then, a few weeks later on the 4th of August 2023, another of these Ukrainian kamikaze sea drones traveled across the Black Sea far enough to enter into the Russian port of Novorossiysk, where it attacked and impacted yet another heavy-duty tank landing ship called the Olenogorsky Gornyak, and reportedly heavily damaged it and likely knocked it out of commission. And since the new year began in 2024, Ukraine's sea drones have continued proving their usefulness. On the first day of February 2024, the Russian guided missile corvette called the Ivanovets was hit and sunk by the Ukrainian kamikaze sea drones as it sat stationary at anchor, close to the western Crimean town of Okonivka. Then, only 13 days later after that, the Ukrainians used a swarm of their kamikaze sea drones to attack, overwhelm, and sink yet another Russian heavy-duty tank landing ship called the Caesar Kunikov, as it was near the shore just off of southern Crimea. After its loss, the head admiral of the Russian Black Sea Fleet was reportedly sacked and replaced. It was a particularly devastating loss for the Russians because it represented the fifth of their heavy-duty tank landing ships in the Black Sea to be destroyed or sunk by the Ukrainians since the invasion began. And they only had 13 of them in the Black Sea to start the war with that cannot possibly be replaced from elsewhere through the Turkish Straits, so long as the war continues going. These ships are very valuable to Russia's war effort in Ukraine because each one can carry up to 10 main battle tanks along with 340 troops and all of their equipment. And they're specifically designed to unload their tanks and troops on a beachhead much faster than a normal ship can. Russia primarily supplies its troops on the front lines in Crimea and Kherson via the Crimean Bridge across the Kerch Strait, which is a dual rail and road bridge that brings in Russian supplies and manpower by train and by truck. But if the Ukrainians manage to permanently knock the bridge offline in another attack, or even knock it offline for a long stretch of time, then Russia will have to switch to using its heavy-duty landing ships to ferry tanks, vehicles, equipment, and troops from the mainland to Crimea and Kherson instead. And so, the more of these kinds of ships that Russia loses in the Black Sea, the more vulnerable of a logistics position the Russians will find themselves in if the Crimean Bridge suffers a more serious attack in the future. And with only 8 of them rather than 13 already, they're already facing a potential problem here. And then the following month in March of 2024, the Ukrainians attacked and managed to sink another significant Russian warship using their kamikaze sea drones. This time, the Sergei Kotov, a large and modern patrol boat that the Russians only finished constructing a few years ago back in 2021, that, according to Ukrainian intelligence, cost them $65 million to build. Each of Ukraine's Magra V5 kamikaze sea drones costs a relatively paltry $250,000 a pop to produce, which means that Ukraine's sea drone program is experiencing a wild return on investment. In less than 1 year, a series of cheap $250,000 sea drones built by Ukraine have destroyed or sunk 4 major Russian surface warships that probably collectively cost more than $100 million to build. The Storm Shadow missiles that Ukraine has also used against the Black Sea Fleet are much more expensive by comparison, at a little more than $3 million per missile, and yet they have still been highly cost-efficient from the Ukrainian perspective in the naval war, sinking or destroying 2 Russian surface warships and 1 submarine that alone cost an estimated $300 million for the Russians to produce. Over the course of the past 2 years now since Russia invaded Ukraine, Kiev estimates that without a navy of their own, they have managed to sink or destroy 26 Russian surface warships and 1 submarine using their combination of missiles and sea drones, which is about a third of all the vessels in the entire Black Sea Fleet and about 40% of the fleet's entire tonnage gone. And naval officers from around the world are almost certainly studying what's happened here over the past couple years in the Black Sea, because the lessons and consequences could be profound and have huge ramifications all around the world. For example, what lessons are the Chinese learning here for their own war plans surrounding a potential amphibious invasion of Taiwan? China has probably anxiously watched on as the on paper vastly more powerful and capable Russian Black Sea Fleet has gotten itself absolutely thrashed by a country that doesn't even really have a navy. And Taiwan has a substantially more formidable navy and budget to work with than the Ukrainians did. It's true that Taiwan's navy pales in comparison to China's on paper, but so did Russia's over Ukraine's. What is to stop Taiwan from pouring their much larger finances than Ukraine into what has clearly worked so well in the Black Sea, and building up an arsenal of thousands of cheap kamikaze sea drones and anti-ship missiles? Would that be capable of halting the Chinese invasion fleet in its tracks the same way that the Ukrainians have halted the Russians in the Black Sea? Moreover, what if non-state actors like the Houthis in Yemen began getting their hands on cheaply made kamikaze sea drones like the Ukrainians? Would the Houthi attacks on merchant shipping in the Red Sea and around the narrow Bab el-Mandeb Strait get far more successful and deadlier if they had these kinds of sea drones at their disposal? There are some analysts who think that Ukraine may have just opened up a Pandora's box in global naval warfare, and that their employed strategies in the Black Sea have proven to be so effective that they may have just made large conventional surface warships an obsolete weapon of war in the 21st century. And back to Ukraine itself, they've been able to build off of the success of their anti-access area denial capabilities that have pushed the Russian Navy far enough away from their shores to open back up their maritime trade routes to global markets. For about a year between July of 2022 and July of 2023, the Russians and Ukrainians had a deal in place that enabled the Ukrainians to continue exporting their economically significant grain and agricultural products to world markets. Ukrainian grain exports were able to return back to pre-war levels under the terms of the deal. But then, the Russians withdrew from the deal in July of 2023 and began bombarding Ukrainian ports with missiles and drones again, while further warning that merchant vessels in the Black Sea sailing to and from Ukraine could come under attack. Policymakers in countries from around the world were terrified that this could mean Ukraine's globally important grain exports to the world market would crash again, just like they did immediately after the invasion began. But with the Black Sea Fleet beginning to be pushed out of both the Western Black Sea and from Crimea, the Ukrainians felt confident enough to devise a new trade route across the Black Sea for their merchant shipping to take, hugging their own coastline within range of coastal artillery batteries and their Neptune anti-ship missiles and their explosive sea drones, before continuing on hugging the coastlines of Romania and Bulgaria, which are both members of NATO, before continuing on towards the Turkish Straits and the global market. And since the entire route follows shallower waters near to the coast, Russian submarines will struggle to operate in them. And since September of 2023, when the Ukrainians started using this new trade route, the Russians haven't attempted a serious attack on it a single time. And the Ukrainians' grain exports have increased to levels even higher than they were before the war, with higher exports in January of 2024 than in January of 2019 or 2020. There were also several unintended consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that have further handicapped their naval potential for future conflicts. Chief among them has been Finland's and soon-to-be Sweden's entry into the NATO alliance, which has effectively transformed the entire Baltic Sea into a NATO-dominated lake. Just a little more than 30 years ago, back in 1989, the Baltic was arguably dominated by the Russians in the form of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, since almost the entire southern shore of the sea was either directly under the control of the Soviet Union itself, or was by proxy in the Warsaw Pact states of Poland and East Germany. And now, only a little more than 3 decades later, a united Germany and an independent Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all join NATO, and with the entrance of Finland and Sweden into the alliance, Russia will only control 2 tiny slivers of the Baltic shoreline around their exclave of Kaliningrad and immediately around St. Petersburg, which means that the ability of the Russian Baltic Fleet to properly engage NATO or any other enemy in combat is basically now non-existent, and the Russians will be forced to essentially write off the usefulness of the entire fleet. And with their catastrophic losses of at least 1/3 of the Black Sea Fleet to the Ukrainians, this has effectively reduced the Russian Navy's usefulness in only 2 years' time to only 2 of their regional seas in the Arctic and the Pacific. And while those 2 fleets were always Russia's 2 most powerful fleets, their overall naval capabilities have still been severely degraded and nearly crippled in the Black and Baltic Seas. But Russia is still eyeing up ways to make the most of their not-so-great naval situation in the Black Sea. In late 2023 and early 2024, the Russians began formulating plans to potentially construct a brand new naval base in the Russian-occupied territory of Georgia known as Abkhazia, within the coastal town of Ochimchire. Ochimchire isn't a deepwater harbor and currently doesn't have any significant naval infrastructure, so Russia won't be able to relocate its submarines or major surface warships there. But they could end up relocating several of their smaller warships there once the port is actually constructed and operational, which could take years to actually finish. But if and when this new port at Ochimchire in Abkhazia is opened, it could end up paying Russia dividends in geopolitical value. First, it could serve as a safe area for many Russian warships remaining in the Black Sea because it's more than 800 kilometers away from any Ukrainian-controlled coastline, and so it's far out of range of Ukraine's cruise missiles and sea drones. But it still places nearly all of Ukraine's territory within firing range of Russia's own Caliber-class sea-fired cruise missiles. allowing them to continue hitting Ukrainian cities and military targets in relative safety compared to in Crimea or in Novorossiysk. But perhaps even more importantly, the presence of Russian warships in Abkhazia would open up the territory to Ukrainian counterattacks eventually, which could bring the consequences of the war to Georgia, which is exactly something that Moscow would like to happen right now. Abkhazia is an internationally recognized part of Georgia that has been occupied by the Russians and claimed to be an independent state ever since the Russians invaded the country back in 2008. Ochemchire is merely 35 kilometers or 22 miles away from the de facto administrative border with Georgia. And very critically, it is only that same distance away from the small Georgian town of Anaklia. Anaklia may not be very important to global affairs just yet, but it is the town that the Georgian government has decided to bank its geopolitical future on. The government has presented a bold $2.5 billion proposal to transform the town of Anaklia into a major deep-water seaport, which will be the first of its kind on the eastern Black Sea. The proposed deep-water port aims to make Georgia the linchpin in the so-called Middle Corridor overland trade route, a continuous route of railroads and sea lanes that is being steadily constructed to link the markets of China and Europe by way of Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia themselves, and Turkey. The Middle Corridor has historically not been a very popular trade route in comparison to the Southern Ocean route that travels through the Suez Canal, or the Northern Corridor route that travels along rail all the way across Russia. But following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the huge economic sanctions that the Western world slapped onto the Russians, governments and businesses have suddenly become much more interested recently in the potential of the Middle Corridor trade route to avoid Russia entirely. And it is with that hope that Georgia is seemingly pinning its hopes for the future on the development of their multi-billion-dollar deep-water port at Anaklia to make themselves a crucial trade node between Europe and China. Of course, though, Russia would not like to see this Georgian idea work out, since it would directly challenge and threaten their own Northern Corridor trade route and also compete with their own port of Novorossiysk. Moreover, if successful, Georgia's port plan could also push the country closer towards the European Union and the West. Less than a week after Russia invaded Ukraine back in early 2022, Georgia formally applied for membership in the European Union, and recently in December of 2023, the European Union officially granted Georgia the status of an EU candidate. Brussels would greatly prefer that a European company be granted the contract to construct the multi-billion-dollar deep-water port at Anaklia, and it could help to boost Georgia's status of ascending from an EU candidate into a fully-fledged EU member state. These are also all things that the Russians would like to prevent and sabotage. And what better way to do so than by moving a large part of their navy down into a town in the occupied Abkhazia, only 35 kilometers or 22 miles away from Anaklia itself. If the ships there began firing missiles toward Ukraine, and then Ukraine retaliated by attacking the port, there would be an active war going on just a stone's throw away from Anaklia. Western insurance and construction companies might then get cold feet about the project and abandon it, potentially leaving the door open to China assuming construction of the project instead or killing it altogether, which could prevent Georgia from joining the European Union, keep them around in Russia's orbit, and safeguard their Northern Corridor trade route over any potential further development of the Middle Corridor. So even though Russia's Black Sea Fleet has already been effectively put into check by the Ukrainians in the war, it's still capable of doing damage and making important plays that shouldn't be overlooked. The war in Ukraine and the political situation in Russia have each evolved considerably over the past 2 years since the Russians initially invaded the country, and it all continues changing rapidly on a daily basis. Over the past 3 months alone, nearly 50,000 news stories about the conflict in Ukraine have been published by sources from all around the world. And plenty of them have been written about the ongoing debate in the United States Congress to allocate another $60 billion worth of US funding for the Ukrainian war effort. The issue of continuing to financially support the Ukrainians or not after more than 2 years of war has become a highly partisan topic in Washington now, with the Democrats generally in favor of continuing and the Republicans generally opposed to it. After Hungary's right-wing Prime Minister Viktor Orban visited Donald Trump at his Florida Mar-a-Lago estate just a few days ago, Orban claimed that if Trump was re-elected to the presidency, he would immediately halt America's financial aid to Ukraine and potentially end the war. 82 sources have reported on the story, and the coverage of it has been fairly evenly split, with 36% of the reporting coming from the left and 34% from the right. But when you really start to compare the headlines around this conflict and how it's portrayed by the media in the United States and elsewhere, you really start seeing something interesting in some of the framing. There's this left-leaning source that refers to Hungary's leader as the autocrat. And then there's this right-leaning source that claims Trump will bring peace to the Ukraine conflict by ending America's funding for it. And this is why I've been using this video's sponsor, Ground News, to research issues in a way that lets me see past these kinds of partisan spins. It's a website and app designed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read and parse the news. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And you can directly compare related articles from different sources to see what details are being emphasized, exaggerated, or left out. I also really like their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are being disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. This feature showed me that if you leaned left, you likely would have missed out on this story about 12 secret CIA spy bases that were built in Ukraine before the 2022 Russian invasion, since only 18% of the sources covering it have come from the left. And if you leaned right, you likely would have missed out on this story about the Pentagon considering tapping its last source of Ukraine military funding, as Congress continues stalling on additional aid for Ukraine, since literally 0% of the sources reporting on it have come from the right. I really strongly believe that it's super important we understand how our current partisan media environment operates, and the impact that it might be having on our politics so that we can engage in constructive dialogue, break out of unproductive echo chambers, and maybe even challenge some of our own assumptions in the process. And best of all, they're currently offering an unprecedented 40% off of the Ground News Vantage plan, which gives you unlimited access to all of their features. So go to ground.news/real-life-lore or click the button that's here on screen, or follow the link down below in the description to subscribe for only $5 a month and help support an independent news platform that's working to make the media landscape more transparent. It'll help out supporting my channel's reporting at the same time, and as always, thank you so much for watching.